National Center for Youth in Custody webinar, Screening and Assessment for Youth in Custody. My name is Pam Clark, and I'm a program assistant with the National Center for Youth in Custody, a national training and technical assistance center created by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and coordinated by the National Partnership for Juvenile Services. The National Institute of Corrections is also a partner with the National Center. We're pleased to have you with us today for a very unique opportunity. As the virtual audience has been able to see from the photographs that were displayed before we started, this webinar is coming to you live from the 20th National Symposium on Juvenile Services in Greensboro, North Carolina. In addition to you, our virtual audience, we have approximately 15 to 20 practitioners attending this live workshop session here in Greensboro. Before we begin the workshop and webinar, I'd like to address two housekeeping matters for our virtual audience. First, this webinar is meant to be interactive, and we encourage everyone in our virtual audience to submit questions through the chat function on your screen. Participants in the live workshop have been provided with 3x5 cards on which they may also note questions for our presenters. Questions on these 3x5 cards will be picked up by Michael Jones in the back of the room if you will just raise them up when they are complete and ready for him to pick up. Following the workshop presentations, we will have a question and answer period where we will field as many of your questions as we possibly can. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation. Second, at the conclusion of the webinar, we would appreciate having the virtual audience complete the electronic survey that will pop up automatically when you exit the program. Having your feedback is vitally important to us as we plan for future webinars at the National Center for Youth in Custody. Before we begin the webinar, if Callie Long is able to connect with us, she will go over some technical aspects of today's presentation. Callie, are you with us? The purpose of screening and assessment and issues related to appropriate and responsible sharing and using of information obtained from these school tools for youth in confinement. This workshop will help participants to distinguish among screening and assessment and risk and mental health tools, list criteria for identifying and selecting evidence-based tools, design a screening assessment system for a confinement setting, including when and how to respond to the information gathered, apply recommendations related to appropriate sharing of information and referrals for additional services, and through questions and answers, participate in a discussion of the role and purpose of family engagement. Our first presenter this afternoon is Dr. Gina Vincent, who is an associate professor and co-director of the Law and Psychiatry program in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, Worcester, Massachusetts? Yes? Is that right, Tina? Worcester, Massachusetts.
It took me a year to figure that out.
Gina is also president of the National Youth Screening and Assessment Partners, a MacArthur Foundation Models for Change Technical Assistance Center for assisting juvenile justice agencies with the selection and implementation of mental health and risk assessments. Thank you, Gina.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you for having me, Pam, and welcome everybody. Thank you for your patience for those of you sitting here and are getting started late. I'm going to try to make up a little time and skip over some things I may have talked about initially. But I do want to kind of set the stage for the presentation today and let you know that my intention is to give you some background about why doing screening and assessment is important for the in your practice for both youth in custody and out for that matter. Give you a little information about screening and assessment, what that means. I'm going to cover some definitional issues, some really basic information, and then give you some specific guidelines for setting up a screening and assessment process in a custody setting. Okay, And then I'm going to turn it over to John Chapman, who's with me today. He's going to be providing a more entertaining discussion about how he actually has done this and pulled it off in Connecticut. They did an amazing job there. I think Connecticut is a great example for a great screening and assessment process in detention, and that's largely due to John Chapman. So there's a few reasons that you might want to know about youth behavioral needs. I'm talking loud because so that the webinar folks can hear me. There's a few reasons you may want to know about youth behavioral needs. One is safety. You want to ensure their safety and so they don't hurt themselves, and you want to ensure the safety of others so that they don't hurt somebody else. Another reason might be child welfare needs. So that is in the sense that you might need to give an immediate response or immediate treatment to someone with a major mental health problem. Third reason might be delinquency prevention. And we're going to be talking about that more when we talk about risk and risk assessment. So you may want to know about their risk level and what types of needs they have. And the last reason is documentation, and this is really key. Screening and assessment tools enable you to have objective measures that will help you capture data over time for your youth over time so that you can report that. You report the needs of your kids. You can report whether they're getting better. You can do a lot of tracking. This really enables you to do some good data documentation. Right. Identification of behavioral health needs is also important for individualized case planning. And this is what we're striving for, is individualized case planning. And here is where we really start delving into risk. And I want to give you some information about why knowing a youth's risk is important. And when I say risk, I mean risk for reoffending, risk for serious or violent reoffending. So first of all, there's pretty good evidence from juvenile justice and juvenile delinquency related studies that punitive sanctions alone without effective services don't do much of anything. They don't reduce recidivism. It doesn't do a lot. So simply locking a youth up, if the reason we're doing that is to deter them from recidivating, that doesn't work. Okay? There was some large-scale studies that have shown kids in the community who have all done dumb things, as kids do, broken the law. If we compare the ones who ended up in the juvenile justice system to the ones who just did dumb things and stayed in the community, the kids who penetrated the juvenile justice system, even minimally, just to receive community service, ended up being twice as likely to be arrested as an adult. All else being equal to the kids who just had no juvenile justice involvement. If a youth ended up on probation, they were 12 times more likely to end up in the adult system. Youth ended up in a custody setting, they were 24 times as likely to end up in an adult setting later on. So simply giving them punitive sanctions doesn't actually do anything to reduce recidivism, right? Second reason that we want to know about youth, we want to know more information about youth so we're making better decisions and individualized decisions, is that approximately 50% of youth who get into trouble, we're not going to see again. And this is based on epidemiological studies. Again, we're dealing with adolescents. They screw up. They do dumb things. A lot of those are things that they could get arrested for. 50% of them aren't going to do it again, or we're not going to see them in juvenile justice again. Low-risk youth, by definition, don't require much intervention. We're not going to see them again, even if we don't do anything. There are some big studies that indicate that. Low-risk youth, by definition, means that they're not likely to reoffend. If we mix low-risk youth with high-risk youth, and what I mean by high-risk youth is youth who are a little more delinquent in nature, have maybe some more antisocial behavior. If we mix these two groups together, we can make low-risk youth worse. Why is that? Because we think the reason for that is that when we're adolescents, the people who are most influential in our life tend to be our peers. Unfortunately, adolescents tend to gravitate more towards the deviant peers than the more pro-social peers. So when we take low-risk youth, put them in a custody setting with higher-risk youth, they learn from each other, and they tend to end up with worse outcomes. Okay? Lastly, the positive side, and one of the great things that we can do is try to match the services that we give to kids in our case planning with their actual needs. When we do that, we find out that we have much better outcomes. So instead of treating everyone with services as usual or treating everybody the same, if we're able to individualize it so that we give them exactly what they need to help reduce whatever it is that's driving them to be delinquent, we're going to have much better outcomes. Here's an example of how we integrate behavioral health needs with risk assessment. And ideally, the earlier we can do screening, the earlier we can do it in the process, the better chance we'll have of making these good decisions early on. So we would hope, so you may have low-risk youth with high behavioral health needs. So that means they're not at risk for reoffending necessarily, but they may have some serious mental health needs that we want to address. One great thing to do with those types of kids is try and divert them into mental health services and away from the juvenile justice system. Youth who are low risk and have no behavioral health needs, we try to do as little as possible. For those of you who are working in custody settings, you're hopefully just going to be dealing with youth on this side of the chart, on the high risk side of the chart. For those kids, if they have behavioral health needs, obviously we want to give them some mental health services. If they don't have behavioral health needs, we don't need to do that. But what we do want to do with all of those youth who are high risk is give them what we call R&R type services. How many of you here have heard of R&R? All right, great. Then I'll teach you something new, hopefully. So R&R is known as risk need responsivity. It's a very well-tested, evidence-based case planning process. What this has shown is that the most effective type of case management requires valid assessment of one's risk and needs. It's 3 parts. We want to match the level of our intervention and the intensity of our intervention to one's risk level. Higher risk youth who are higher risk to reoffend get more. They need more intensive intervention. They need more intensive supervision. They get more. These may be the youth that end up in your custody settings. They don't have to end up in a custody setting in order to manage their risk. Depends on the kid. But the higher the risk, the more they get. It's a very simple concept. Okay? And we can determine this with good assessment tools. Now, the mere fact that we know someone is high risk doesn't tell us exactly what to do with them. You can have 2 youth who are both high risk, and they have different things that are driving that risk behavior. They have different needs. They have different areas where we want to target for services. Think about this. Consider that you're all doctors, and you have 2 different patients come to you with this, and they both have jaundice. So they're both the same symptom presenting. One of them is coming to you for jaundice because they have an infection of some sort. The other one is coming to you with jaundice because they like their vodka. So are you going to give those 2 people the same treatment? Probably not. The infection person probably needs antibiotics. The vodka drinker probably needs a lot of other things, not antibiotics. Okay, so it's the same when we're dealing with youth and their behavioral health needs. We can have 2 youth that look the same. They're both high risk. That's the same symptom. They are having different root causes. That's where we get to the need. We call these needs, what they really are is dynamic or changing risk factors. A risk factor is anything that increases the likelihood that somebody's going to reoffend. Some of these change over time, and some of them don't. I'm going to get into more detail about what these are later, but for example, substance abuse, that's a risk factor. It's something that increases the likelihood someone's going to offend, especially depending on the substance, okay? But it's something we can change. Unstable or family structure, or a family structure where there's not a lot of parental discipline or parental supervision, that's also a risk factor for kids. It increases the likelihood they're going to get into trouble. That is something, conceivably we can change, right? There's different risk factors out there. Some of them are changeable and some of them aren't. We talk about the changeable ones as the needs. That's what we want to identify in our risk assessment tools so we can help make decisions about what it is that kid really needs. The last piece about this is responsivity. This is a much more difficult concept to understand. I just try to explain this as the art of case planning. There's not a lot of science behind it. Basically, what it means is you want to try and match whatever it is you're doing to certain aspects of that kid, certain traits of that youth. So, for example, if you have a girl, there may be girl-specific programming that you want to use. If you have someone from a specific culture, say Hispanic, there may be culturally specific programming you want to use. If you have a youth coming to you with a major learning disability or reading difficulty, you probably don't want to stick them in a cognitive behavioral therapy program. It's probably not going to do a lot of good. So there's some art to this, knowing who it is you're dealing with and trying to match the mode, the services to their needs. How many of you here are social workers or counselors? Okay, great. So this is key to what you do. This type of stuff is key to what you do. All right. Here is a chart illustrating to you the impact that good case planning can have. So this is based on a study where a risk assessment was done with all of these kids. They ended up on probation, and then the researchers went to see what kinds of services those kids received while they were on probation. And they then went to see if those services actually matched a risk factor area that the kid had. Right? Because kids get lots of services. Sometimes it's not what they need. It's just what the court thinks is popular at the time, or it's just what you have available in the community. That's the best you can do. So there's kids who get lots of services, but it doesn't do them any good necessarily. So this group, the poor match group, this bar over here, are kids that got services that didn't meet any need that they actually had. This group over here, the good match group, is the kids that got services that were only in direct response to problems those youths actually had. And you can see the kids who didn't get services they needed had a 75% recidivism rate. The kids who got services that they did need had a 30% recidivism rate. Dramatic difference. This is irrespective of the risk level of the kid. So even if you had a high-risk youth, just giving them the services they need in your case planning made a huge difference. So that's some of the background as to why we want to know about the kids through screening and assessment. What are their problems? What are their unique circumstances? So that we can do a better job of trying to reduce their risk in the future or reduce their mental health symptoms in the future. How are we doing for time? Okay. All right. So then we're going to talk about some of the basics. I'm sure you guys have heard the term screening and assessment. They're often used interchangeably. You hear people, you even hear C tools labeled, this is a screening and assessment tool. There's no such thing as a screening and assessment tool. These are two different things. Okay? A screening tool is short. It's designed to be used with every youth coming into a system. If you're in a custody setting, every youth who comes in at intake should get the screening tool. You don't pick and choose who gets the screening tool. It's done for everybody. It identifies youth who might have the problem that you're interested in. Who might have the problem you're interested in. Okay? It's short, it's easy, it's something frontline staff can administer, it's something kids usually can take in about 15 minutes. That's a screening tool. The goal of a screening tool is to help you sort kids into people who probably don't have the problem, who are very unlikely to have the problem, and then kids who are much more likely to have the problem. So two groups, kids who are very unlikely to have the problem and kids who might have the problem. So it helps you sort kids into two categories. It doesn't tell you for sure if they do have a problem. The idea is those who are screened in, those who might have the problem, then get followed up with an assessment. Assessment is much more comprehensive. It's something that requires specialized training to do. It usually requires much more information gathering, okay? And it's the part that's going to tell you give you information about what kinds of services the youth needs, what kinds of disposition the youth may need, what type of interventions, supervision level, and so forth. The assessment is what gives you that meat, that information. This screening to assessment idea has been around in the medical profession forever. So for those of you who might be in my age group, you may remember when we were kids in school, we had these TB tests that they gave us. There was a pinprick on our arm. Every kid got one to see if we had TB, or basically to screen us for TB. If I remember right, you come back 3 days later and your arm may have bubbled up, and if it did bubble up, you cried, and then you went and got an assessment, okay? Because all that meant is that you might have been exposed to TB or you might have TB. It didn't tell you whether you did in fact have TB. You had to go get an assessment to determine that. There is no way the medical system could consume the burden of assessing everyone for TB. So what it does is it screens everybody with this easy pinprick that's cheap, and then follows up just those who get screened in. We do the same thing with behavioral health problems. Pregnancy tests you can buy from any drugstore. Those are screening tools. The only real pregnancy test is an assessment with an ultrasound. We could never take the burden of giving an ultrasound to every woman who thought that she was pregnant, so we use screening tools. The same thing, we do the same thing with behavioral health issues. Okay? It's a process for feasibility, it's more practical, it's less expensive, and it helps us only give more attention to the kids who really need it. So that's the difference between screening and assessment. The tools that you use, there are some requirements for those. They should be objective, they should be standardized so that anyone who administers the tool does it in the same way. If you have a suicide screening tool, a mental health screening tool, what have you, they should all have a manual that tells you how everyone would do it in the same way. Tools should also be evidence-based. That means that you want evidence that the tool is reliable, which means that if John and I were to both assess a youth using the same instrument, we should come to the same conclusion. You also want tools that are valid. That means that there's research that shows that it actually works for its intended purpose. Right? If the tool doesn't have all of this research evidence, it may not actually work. It may not actually be doing what it is that you want to do. It's wonderful. There's a lot of facilities and a lot of juvenile justice agencies who have developed their own tools to try and help and make their process more objective. And it's great to strive for objectivity. Objectivity is better than everybody just kind of bringing in their personal biases into making decisions. So objectivity is preferred, but we also want to take that other step and make sure that what we're using actually works. There are different kinds of tools for different purposes. And the earlier we do these in the process, like I said, the better. There's all kinds of different tools. There's screening tools, there's assessment tools, there's risk tools. There's different types of risk tools. So there's risk tools that help you make a decision about whether you should go to pretrial detention. It's done early in the process. There's risk tools that help you make a decision about whether to divert the youth away from formal processing or keep them in. There's mental health screening tools and substance abuse screening tools that can be used early in the process. Ideally, you'd like to use a comprehensive risk assessment tool early on that will help you make decisions about disposition or make recommendations for disposition, and then later also help you make recommendations for services. So the earlier the tool can be used, the more it can help with, the more decisions it can help with. I need to go back because these were out of order. So I'm going to give you a little more detail about what a risk assessment tool is. And I'm sorry, I just showed a slide that the webinar didn't see, but the point from that slide was that there's different tools used at different points. And let's tell you what a risk assessment tool is. How many of you have heard of risk assessment? Okay, good. How many of you are from North Carolina? All right, so, okay, great. So I'll use North Carolina as an example then. So here, the NCAR is a tool that's used on probation, if it's still being used, or at the probation point, okay? That is what we would refer to as a brief risk assessment. A brief risk assessment tool is something that simply answers the question for you, is this youth at relatively low or relatively high risk for reoffending? Are they at relatively low or relatively high risk for reoffending? That's the only thing those risk assessment tools are designed to tell you. They're pretty short, They're usually fairly easy to fill out. They don't require a whole lot of information, although you do want to gather some information from collateral sources, and they'll give you that information. There are other types of risk tools that answer both that question and get more of the dynamic risk factors, or what we call criminogenic needs, so that we can helpfully tell what might be also causing that use risk. So you have short risk tools that just answer the question, is this youth relatively high or relatively low risk? Then you have comprehensive risk assessment tools that answer both that question and the second question, which is, what's likely to be causing this youth to reoffend or to offend? Is it substance abuse? Is it problems in the home? Is it some major disruptive behavioral problems, etc.? Some examples of tools that do this. Now you all have it split up between the NCAR and a needs assessment. There's tools that combine some of these together, which some examples would be like the YLS, the YAZI, the PACT, the SAVORY. These are tools you may have heard of. Right? Skip this. The comprehensive risk assessment tool will contain all of these pieces: static risk factors, dynamic risk factors, or otherwise known as criminogenic needs, and protective factors. They will not contain, or should not contain, what we refer to as well-being needs or non-criminogenic needs. These dynamic risk factors are what enable us to measure change in risk. So ideally, with a comprehensive risk assessment tool, and a youth coming into custody, you assess their risk one point in time, hopefully assess their risk again 6 months later, and you'll be able to tell if it's gone down. Hopefully it hasn't gone up, but you'll be able to tell if it went up too. I'm going to give you a little more definition about each of these components. So a risk factor, as I mentioned, is anything that elevates the likelihood that somebody's going to reoffend. There are two types. There's static and there's dynamic. So some examples of static risk factors are things that I have mentioned here. These are things that don't change. For example, the number of prior arrests, the age the youth was first arrested, the age they first started abusing substances. Actually, that's a pretty big risk factor. If somebody started abusing substances prior to age, I think 13, that's very different from someone who started abusing substances later at age 17. It's a bigger risk factor the earlier they start, because it's abnormal. Static risk factors are things that don't change. So look at these. These are things that if we know these about a youth, we can make some kind of prediction or some kind of estimate that they're going to be maybe higher risk than another youth. But there's nothing we can do about this. It is what it is. It doesn't change. It may increase. Their number of prior arrests may increase, but there's nothing we can do about this. It doesn't tell us what to do to treat them. So if this is all the information that we have, it doesn't give us much information for case planning. So we have a second set of risk factors that are just as important in deciding whether somebody is going to reoffend. But these are also things that change over time, especially if we do something about it or help a youth to do something about it. These are things that I mentioned before: inconsistent or lax discipline in the home. If that's one of the main risk factors or main features going on with this youth, we may give them functional family therapy or some kind of family engagement service. Impulsivity or behavioral problems, big risk factors. Impulsivity, attention deficit, hyperactivity, these are risk factors at this age. Callous, unemotional traits, big risk factor. Substance abuse, delinquent peers. They're in a gang, they're hanging out with kids who are doing bad things, also big risk factors. These are all areas where we can intervene. We can measure it later on and see if they've improved. Now, there has been something out there you may have heard from Attorney General Holder, where he's advocated, he's talked about his concerns about these static risk factors being racially biased. You look at those static risk factors, If we agree that there is disproportionate minority contact in the people who get arrested, then we'd have to think that those risk factors are racially biased. There's going to be some racial disparity. I always suggest that you try to strive for using tools that are going to be have risk factors based on what youth actually did, not whether they were arrested. So self-report, what was the age of your first violent act? How many violent acts have you engaged in? How much crime have you participated in? It's harder to get at this information, but when you actually get to self-reported, not criminal histories, but self-reported histories, there's much less racial disparity in that information. So we strive for tools where you can get the best information possible. These factors are very predictive of what youth do in the future. Okay, there's much less racial disparity there. It's not easy to get at this information, so we often end up relying on some of the tools that are easier to fill out. But I do want to say that there is possible to get static risk factors where there's not this problem. There's not as much of a problem. Okay. Well-being needs, when I mentioned that, these are things that we might be interested in because especially if the youth is in custody, we may need to help them or deal with these kinds of things, but they're not risk factors, so they don't belong in risk assessment tools, right? So things like learning disability, we may need to know that in order to get the youth the proper interventions, but it's not a risk factor, so it doesn't belong in our calculation of whether someone is high or low risk. Medical needs, some mental health related variables are risk factors, some are not. Okay? So well-being needs is something you may be interested in, you may want to assess, but it's not part of a risk assessment. All right. Definitions of low, moderate, high risk. Just want to make the point that all it means if someone is high risk is that if we do nothing, this youth is likely to reoffend. If we do nothing, this youth is more likely to reoffend than his peers or her peers. That's what high risk means. It doesn't mean if I label John as high risk, which you'll see after he starts talking that it probably is. If I label John as high risk, that doesn't mean I need to lock him up in order to protect public safety. It doesn't mean he's going to go out and hurt somebody tomorrow. It just means that he's more likely to hurt someone than I am, and so I want to do something to prevent that from happening. Okay? Okay, putting it all together. So if you're in a custody setting, what's the ideal way to set up a screening and assessment system? Well, first, you want to have some kind of initial screening that tells you immediate concerns. Is there a suicide risk? Is there a major substance abuse problem where we need to do some detox? What are the immediate concerns? Okay, immediate medical issues too. I don't know much about screening for medical issues. You guys probably know way more about that than I do, but that's also a piece. Second, do some kind of initial classification, short risk tool to make a decision about security level. I would not even do this phase if you're already using a good risk assessment in probation that you're getting once a kid comes into custody, or you have the means to do a more comprehensive risk assessment when someone walks in your door. That's the ideal situation, is to do a comprehensive risk assessment tool, like the YLS, the YAZI, the PACT, something that will give you information about programming, and do that early on. Supplement that with additional screening tools as needed. Trauma, for example, is not covered in risk assessment tools. You may want to do a trauma screen, right? Lastly is dynamic progress reporting, measuring every 3 months or whatever your policy is to see if things have improved. Now, picking the best screening tool and putting them in place is not, it doesn't stop there. It's way more important that your staff know how to use those tools in their decisions. It's way more important that they're bought in to the idea of using those tools, that you've got it sort of memorialized into your procedures, that you use it for data reporting. This is a guide that we wrote about how to implement risk assessment screening tools. It's free. You can download it off the web, and it describes all 8 steps of implementation. That is the most important thing. It's not just what tools you use, it's how you put them in place. We know that if you pick a tool, you teach your staff how to fill it out, they fill it out, it sits in a file, and nobody uses it. That's not doing anybody any good. And that's what happens pretty often. So this is some guidelines about how to use that. I'm not going to get into detail about the implementation process because John is going to be talking about some of that. So I'm going to leave you with this as we transition to John. Just some take-home messages that first, we want to develop a comprehensive assessment system that addresses the essential elements, that is behavioral health, risk, and dynamic risk. Appropriate implementation activities are going to be crucial to actually having that lead to any change in the way that you handle youth. And lastly, these tools can be used to help you aggregate data and look at individual progress. All right.
Gina, one more thing before John steps up. Could you go ahead and tell them where to go to get that document? We've already had that question come up, your new implementation guide.
Did we put the address on here?
I didn't see it.
I did not. Okay. So to get the implementation guide, you can go to, you can Google NYSAP, NYSAP, and go to our website and download it from there. You can also download it from the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change website. If you go to the Models for Change website, the publications, it's down. You can download it there. So it's in 2 different locations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vincent. Our next presenter is Dr. John Chapman, who, along with Dr. Vincent, remapped the screening and assessment protocols for juvenile detention in the state of Connecticut. Dr. Chapman recently retired from the Connecticut Judicial Branch, where he was the responsible health authority for all Connecticut detention centers. Dr. Chapman.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for inviting me to speak. I'm really delighted anytime I can share a podium with Dr. Vincent. Just a small correction. I was the responsible health authority, but then moved over to work in the courts, things like that. So moving it along into it, and the first thing I want to do is get my face up here, because it looks very old, is to talk about the issues that we're going to discuss today. Gina covered a lot of what was there, and the one thing I was going to tell you actually was to go get that manual. So do download it from NYSAP or from the MacArthur Foundation Models for Change, because it's a very important document, and it really guides a lot of things. So what I'm going to talk about really is the benefits of juvenile screening and assessment, but I'm also going to talk about some of the challenges therein and some of the great difficulties that are existing in the system. So I really should have called this the good, the bad, and the ugly, but I left it as it really was. So let me try. I need to speak up. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. And the benefits that we're going to talk about start with the question: why would you screen in detention or corrections, but also in private facilities and things like that? Why screen? Well, screening and assessment, as Gina said, are not the same thing. Screening is done initially to find any problems. And it starts the minute a young person walks in the door. If you see someone who comes in and they're bleeding, that's in the screen. You've looked at it and you know that you got to get them some help right away. And if you look further to someone, you would give a screening instrument to find any acute problems that come up. And if you're looking and finding acute problems, then you need to take care of it. What are some of the acute problems that you imagine? Well, I think that the most acute problem that you can worry about in a facility is suicide. And the people in the room here, have you encountered suicidal youth? Or I should say, who has not encountered suicidal youth? And I don't see anyone's hands going up. So most are sleeping, but the ones who are not answering are saying that, yeah, it's common to come across suicidal youth. Do we play with that? Do we worry about that? Do we take some risks with that? No. You go ahead and you begin to screen, and you find out what's going on. If you're using a screening instrument, can it be wrong? Can it tell you that a kid is suicidal, but they really are not? Absolutely. You know, it's called a false positive, and they come along and you get them, and you go through a lot to make that screening, and you find out, well, you know, it was a false positive. Is that a loss for you? No, not at all. It means you're being cautious, and it means you're being careful. So for everyone to do the screenings and assessments in any kind of facility means a lot of work. And that can be met by a lot of resistance, because who wants more work on their plate? And someone might come up to you and say, well, why should I do this? I mean, we can just talk to them. We can just ask them. Why do we have to give this instrument? Why do we have to do this scale? Why do we have to go through all of this? And the answer really lies in the fact that you want an instrument that's been shown to be valid and reliable, as Gina said, because not only does it help you identify the children who need immediate help, who need urgent help, or who might need help later down the road, but it also protects you in saying that you used a screening instrument in the event of some kind of crisis that goes on later on, so that you've looked for it and you can defend yourself by saying that you've looked for it. Oh, I think I went too fast here on the clicker. But selection of a screening instrument is sometimes contentious. There's a lot of screening instruments out there. I might like one, Gina might like another, you may like a different one. How do you get to the point where you choose one? Well, you're probably not going to say, well, let's do them all, because that might be redundant. But you're going to have to really kind of have some strong leadership that's going to guide what needs to be done. And that leadership needs to know about the validity and the reliability of the instrument, what the population was that it was normed on. For years, we used to use instruments that were not normed on juvenile justice populations because there was no research going on in juvenile justice. It just didn't happen. So when we started to make changes in that, we found the Maisie, first of all, when it was first published, and we called up UMass and said, hey, can we meet with you on this, and can we get it, and how do we do this? And they were most accommodating. They were great. And this one was actually normed on juvenile justice population. It was amazing to us. So it really made a big difference. So we had that, and in some cases when we've needed to add instruments or make changes, we've had some really strong administrative leadership. And people who said, hey, we're going to do this, it's going to get going, and it's going to happen, and let's make it go. So additionally, that decision is made, but you also need to have stakeholders, and you need to have strong quality staff along with you. So who are your stakeholders, and why do you need them? Well, stakeholders could be a number of different people. They should be diverse, and they should come from a number of different areas that you're dealing with. If you're dealing with courts, you might want a representative from the courts. If you have a psychologist or a social worker, you might need them on board to determine this. If you have attorneys who are involved in that, you might consider having the attorneys present as well. Someone from the bench might be very helpful. And perhaps most importantly, is community partners. You might need community partners and family advocates, because they need to know that the instruments that you're giving their children, in a community sense, that the instruments that you're giving to their children are important, why they're important, what the reasons are, and why you're selecting them. And most importantly, what you're going to do with the information. Because if you test my kid, I'm going to say, oh, what are you doing with that information? I didn't want him to tell you these things because maybe it's going to hurt his case. That happens. So you want the family engagement. You want the family partnership in there. Really, it's important to get families together because it's hard sometimes in juvenile justice to get families to really participate in what you want them to. So when it's difficult, you need to really have that and to fall back on the fact that you use families for your stakeholders. So So when you're selecting an implementation or instrument or implementing an instrument for screening, you want to consider the following. And the first is, what do you want to know? Why are you doing this? What do you want to know? What do you want to know? I'll ask the room here. What might be the most important thing you want to know? Somebody
They won't be able to hear.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So the most important thing that you might want to know is because you want to maintain the safety of the child. You want to maintain the safety of them, and you want to maintain the safety of other people who are around them. You want to see who might be acute and who might be in urgent need and who you might have to act on right away. And another reason might be, how do you get your staff to follow suit on this? Because you can't implement something new without training and without staff involvement, because the staff need direction. So if the staff are giving an instrument and it comes back and says, oh my God, this kid is so suicidal, we're very worried. Well, what did you tell your staff to do afterwards? Or what do you as staff do, as line staff do? You need guidance, you need direction, because it's a big responsibility. So there can't be any problems with clarity. And these things all require strong administrative input, and they require a push from administration so that it's written down. And once it's written into policy and they're going to find it, it's going to be useful, because then that gives you what needs to happen. And, okay, I got to speak up a little bit. Okay. Yeah, you need to know what needs to happen and what is the next step. And if that's in policy, you've got a lot going for you. So since knowledge is power, that's great, but it also brings a lot of responsibility. And you've got to have your quality staff in the discussion from the very beginning. So the staff that you rely on every day, you want them there. You want to have them hear what attorneys and families have to say. And you want your line staff to be given who you're giving the majority of work to do, to know how critical their position is and why this is important. And that they're not just armored guards or not armored guards, but regular guards. They're not guards. They're staff. They're juvenile detention staff. They're correctional staff. They're community staff. And all this needs to be important. And people need to know how important it is. So line staff then get the majority of the work to do, but their work then relates to later assessment. And once you've done the initial screenings and you've decided that you've got someone who's safe to continue, you can go ahead and they can be assessed at a later point by someone else if need be. When we talk about the screening and assessment, local, county, state administrators should be involved as the work moves forward. One big reason for that is that if you get a bunch of screening data, it can either be filed away and put away, or you can analyze it for trends, which should tell you how many emergencies you should expect, how many emergencies in this place, in that place, how many problems come up, and what you need to gear for. It can actually, when you consider it, be used to save money or to make arguments for improved budgets. So analysis of this screening and assessment information, mostly the screening expert information, provides information on trends that you may see in the population. While we're seeing a lot of kids with traumatic stress needs, we're seeing a lot of substance abuse kids. We've had a jump in suicidal kids that we've seen. We've got to consider this and take this into custody, into our care with the kids who we have in custody. So think about not only what has to be, what you have to do right at the moment, but what you may need to do in the future. And that's fairly important, because the quality of the screening instrument is definitely something that you want to consider. So you want to watch for any breakdown in quality, any changes in quality that may come about as a trend. For that to matter to you, you want to know, are there a lot of youth going unscreened? If so, why? There shouldn't be that. There shouldn't be youth going unscreened. Are there delays in getting the information? Are youth not being given the screening instruments that they need to be given at the proper time? Do they not get it at the time of intake, which is most important? And there's times then that you need to sit down and troubleshoot this, and sit down with your staff and kind of get this under control. So once a policy is written, it really requires enforcement, and it provides the opportunity for you to manage this, but also the opportunity to provide praise and feedback to the staff. And those are really important things, especially as you have staff who are identifying very critical kids with very critical needs who are being hospitalized. And one thing we found in Connecticut when we started with the probation offices is that we started hospitalizing a lot of kids right out of the probation office, whereas it hadn't been done before. So screening requires follow-up. It requires you to do something. And you know what? It's a lot of work. Thank you. So you want to look at assessments as well. And assessments you may or may not get a hold of, but usually you're going to get a hold of, and it's going to tell you what you should do with the child. And what you should do with that child then needs to be clear. So are your assessments complete? Are they done properly? Do they look sometimes to be cookie cutter, like somebody's recommending the same thing over and over again, not really considering who the child is? Are the names correct? Are the statements illogical, or is there problems with your assessments as well? And are inappropriate instruments being used? Because if I go in and show someone maybe some ink blots or some pictures and tell them a story and then write about their personality, that might not be enough. Unless I'm a true genius, it might not be enough to do that. So this is the follow-up. That's critical because it tells you what to do with this child. And you need to consider the risk, needs, and responsivity model that Gina was just discussing. So a young person also needs to know where their information is, who's going to see it, where's it going, and so do their lawyers. Because one of the things that we encountered was a lot of lawyers saying, don't answer any questions, and when they ask you to do this screening instrument called the maze, you don't do it. Because the lawyers didn't know or didn't care where it was going. And that was extremely difficult. It is extremely difficult because it leaves you in the dark about what you're doing with the child. So you need to be clear with who sees the individual data. And that may be the physician or maybe the mental health staff. It may be, the staff supervision, or the supervising staff, the line staff may see it. So you need to be clear about that. But one of the most important worries that people have is whether this information is going to go to court and hurt them. And what we did in Connecticut was we lobbied for legislation to ask for prevention of disinformation to go to court. We didn't want it to go to court. So we said, we need a law that protects this information so that it can't be used against the child. And now we have it, and it works very well because nothing we do is going to really hurt the child that we might have. So I want to just finish up by saying you need to have a lot of thought go into an instrument. It's not good enough to say, well, this state is using it, we should just use it. You need to consider it. You probably need a psychologist to look at it and say, yeah, okay, so I think that based on what the published information is on this instrument, it's worth doing. It's worth happening. And we need to really consider who it works for as well, because we need to make sure, or we need to accommodate any instruments that don't work the same way for minorities or for girls. We need to consider all that. So we have to consider gender, and we have to consider any racial issues in the screening and assessments that we have. And this is work Gina and I have done in the past on some instruments to look and make sure that there's no racial bias in certain instruments. And that's important. And also to look at, and it was presented a couple of years ago, the American Psychology and Law Society, to make sure that it's okay for girls too, that valid information is there for girls. I want to just thank you for having me. Pam, I want to thank you and the entire organization and the conference for inviting me. It's been a pleasure being here, and thank you for listening to my my presentation.
Well, we have a number of questions from our virtual audience. So if you and Dr. Vincent would field those questions, that would be great. If anyone in the live audience has a question, remember you have the card. Michael will pick those up if you have anything. So I'm going to start with the virtual audience questions. The first one is, does the screening tool, and I'm assuming this is the screening tool you were talking about in your opening, does it have a question about gang involvement? Or is that a question that's typically in a screening tool?
I'm not sure what screening tool they're referring to, but most risk assessment tools, a good risk assessment tool will have a question about peers, and whether it's referred to as negative peer relationships, peer delinquency, or however they refer to it, there's a few questions related to peers. And within that, there's usually questions about whether there's gang involvement. If someone's got gang involvement, almost inevitably they're rated as high as having peer delinquency issues. So yeah, any risk assessment tool will cover that. They may not have that as a specific question, but it's assumed within that.
Okay, the next question is, are you aware of a comprehensive risk assessment that identifies risk of aggression, victimization that meets PREA standards?
That is an excellent question, and it's so nice that we have John Chapman here, because how many of you are familiar with PREA standards? Okay, great. So the PREA standards were written so that PREA tools have to contain certain information. It's written in the legislation what a PREA tool has to contain. And it is intended to identify people both who are at risk of sexual aggression of others and risk of victimization. This is very unusual to have any kind of screen that's validated to do both of those things. We're talking about different sets of risk factors. Kids who are at risk for victimization are often different from kids who are at risk of perpetration. So, have I seen one that's been validated? No. Are a lot of the risk factors that are in that legislation, some of them have good research evidence behind them, some of them don't, to be honest. You need to include it. The state of Connecticut is working on a tool that I think looks very promising, where they have been able to split those up and give good definitions and add other indicators into it too. They're in the process of validating it. I know a few other states are in the process of validating it. A problem with validating a PREA tool, it's hard because in order to really validate one of these tools, you need to see whether it predicts a sexual incidence in your facility. You have to see whether it really predicts sexual incidents. And in order to find that out from research, you've got to kind of let kids get into sexual incidents in your facility to find out if that actually happened. No one's going to do that.
Or encourage that.
No, I wouldn't encourage that. No ethical board would allow me to encourage that. So these are going to be really hard tools for us to validate. We're going to do the best we can based on what research has to offer, but I haven't seen anybody do it yet. It's a great question.
I think there's some very good assessment for risk assessment for violence. And there was a publication that came out, I forget the author, a few years ago, that looked at 3 different instruments. And, this very strong instrument, this Avery, was a very strong instrument, did not predict sexual offenses. So it's, you're looking at a cow and trying to describe a sheep, and it's just not the same thing.
It's a really good point that we have good risk assessment tools to predict aggression, general aggression and violence, or delinquent behavior. They don't predict sexual offending behavior because sexual offending behavior is different. There's special tools for that, and my recommendation to people is always, if you think there's a problem with that, refer them to a special evaluation. Refer them for a special evaluation.
A question that has continued to come up here is, I think people are trying to find out, is there a comprehensive tool, one tool that is comprehensive in terms of what it screens for, that you are aware of and that you would recommend?
As we always say, there are different tools designed for different purposes. A mental health screen is a mental health screen. A risk assessment is a risk assessment. Finding one comprehensive tool that does both of those things well, no. There are some risk assessment tools that have put in some mental health screening modules. To my knowledge, those mental health screens haven't been validated, at least not to the extent that the MAISY has been. That doesn't mean that they don't have some good promise, but different tools are designed for different purposes. There is no one-size-fits-all tool. That's why we recommend you have a comprehensive risk assessment tool that you supplement with behavioral health screens. So trauma, for example, that's not going to be captured well in any mental health screening tool or any risk assessment tool. That's going to require its own. So would you answer that in the same?
I'd answer it in the same way, because we were delighted when the MAISY was first published, or the research on the MAISY was first published, because we found an instrument that was validated or that was normed on juvenile justice kids that we hadn't had at that point. So that was when we got ourselves up to UMass and met with Tom Grisso and started using the MAISY, because it was, for our purposes, somewhat comprehensive. It tackled a number of different areas. It tackled suicide, it tackled aggression, and it tackled a number of other things. So we never changed, at least not since the month I've been retired. I don't believe it's been changed. It's just been an all-around good instrument for 15 years now, or 14 years, I guess it's out now.
But it's still, I mean, it's just a mental health screen. It's not.
It is.
It's not for.
It's not
and substance abuse is in there, but it's not for risk and it's not for needs. It's mental health.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the other risk assessment need that we put in place afterwards was the Savory, which was written by Randy Borum, and some people are really good, really big fans of it, like me. Other people don't like it. So it's a difference in opinion on what you're looking for and on what works.
So I have a question here about whether assessment tools can determine causes or correlates.
That's a good question, and that's a very good question. So risk assessment tools are going to, that have dynamic risk factors, are picking out things that we know are correlated with delinquency. The only way to find out if something is really a cause of delinquency is to do an experimental study, and that's very hard to do. So they're correlates. What you do as part of your assessment is you're trying to figure out whether that seems to be the actual need that seems to be driving that used delinquency or not. That's still an area where there's a lot of research to be done. We need good studies to show that when something goes down, delinquency actually changes. Where those studies have been done well is with substance abuse. So I can say that substance abuse is a cause for some kids. There's good studies that have to do with some type of disruptive behavior problems. So we can say that that is also a cause. But a lot of it has been correlational, absolutely.
Okay. This is a question that we know a lot of people have. So many of the screens and assessments are collected and then maintained in the silos of the discipline, mental health, probation, a detention facility. Are there any evidence-based processes for the sharing of screening and assessment data and multidisciplinary intervention planning?
Evidence.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say absolutely. There are possibilities for data to be redacted so that a name does not appear on that. We have had the ability in Connecticut for quite a long time, with judges' permission, to share data and information so that it becomes useful in the aggregate to make predictions about behavior, to analyze that, In one study that was published in Learning Individual Differences, we found that when you have a combination on the MASI of depressed, anxious, or angry, irritable, and I think depressed, anxious, it was predictive of school problems. And that's not surprising because our kids have a lot of school problems. So there should be a lot of research done, and it should be redacted. And when you use something like the MASI, there's no name on it anyway. It's a number that's assigned. So it means nothing to me if I come to North Carolina and say, should I look at your MASIs? I don't see a name.
I would just add that I think that the question is probably also related to information sharing within the system. So John has done a great job of sharing information for researchers, but information sharing within the system, which is essential. If you're doing an assessment on probation and you're not sharing that information with the custody staff where that youth ended up, then the information's lost. If you are doing an assessment as a probation officer and you're not sharing that information with the service providers that youth goes to, the information's lost. So having good information sharing in place is essential to conserve the continuity of care for your kids. There is a module done at Georgetown University on information sharing. They do it a few times a year. It's a certificate program. Lourdes Rosado has written a manual on this that you can also download from the MacArthur Models for Change website. Very important. I would just add, the one challenge is when you do assessments pre-adjudication, like John has done in detention, pretrial, those assessments are all done pre-adjudication. There's self-incriminatory, there's a potential for self-incrimination when you're doing risk assessment at that phase, but it can be done. There's a few states that have put good legislation in place so that information is protected. Those youth will tell you, what information you need to do a valid assessment, and it's protected. It's not used against them in adjudication. It's not shared before adjudication. It's just shared after. So there are very good models for this. And I highly recommend that information sharing be a priority. Yeah.
Should the people delivering services be the ones to complete the screenings and assessments?
The people delivering the services? Some states have done an amazing job of this. I think the people that should be doing the screening and assessment starts with juvenile justice and starts with probation or whatever intake setting you have prior to that. Some people have diversion, court intake people, whatever. It's early in the process. But then the service providers are also trained, hopefully, on maybe if you have one comprehensive risk assessment, the service providers are also trained so they can do the reassessments. Because these are meant to be reassessed. There's a lot of service providers that do their own assessment tools, and mental health assessments are something that your juvenile justice people aren't going to do. Your service providers need to do that. So there's some areas where the service providers, yes, it's great. Hopefully they are doing it too, or you're sharing the same information. And there's some areas where it only makes sense for the service provider to do it.
Well, I would just add that on screening instruments, you're looking for urgent, critical need. So these need to be done very quickly.
Yes.
And so unless the screening or the service providers are there 24/7,
right,
you are going to have your staff, line staff do it. And the line staff can handle it, and they can handle the issues around it, especially with good policy. And I think, and I'll go back to the other question as well, what you need is a meeting once a week with service providers, with staff, with psychiatry and teachers, and that's where a lot of information sharing needs to happen in that meeting, so that everybody's on the same page.
There are a couple of questions here about whether the two of you could either recommend some reliable assessment instruments or let people know where they could go and find a clearinghouse of information on reliable screening and assessment tools.
Okay, I'm just going to say that this is not easy, and we considered doing that. NISAP is a Screening and Assessment Technical Assistance Center. We considered doing that and designing a clearinghouse. The problem is this is very fluid. New tools come out frequently. Tools that exist become evidence-based, because our research is always advancing. I could tell you today that a tool we don't know if a particular tool is valid. 2 weeks from now, that answer could change. So it's really hard to have a clearinghouse that's reliable. I know NTAC was in charge of designing something that's online, that you all may know better, where they put a bunch of screening tools for juvenile justice populations online and made recommendations. I don't know if they have continually updated it because it came out a few years ago. So is there one place where you can get all that information about mental health screening and risk assessment? I'm not sure.
I'm not aware of any one place.
If you want recommendations for specific tools,
yes, they're looking for a place where they could go at least to get a listing of tools that have been researched, validated, etc.
If the OJJDP website is still up, I can't recall the name of the website now. If it's still up, that's a good starting point. Do you recall the name?
And Michelle did just send a message that NTAC, that is not a responsibility of NTAC.
Oh,
so
sorry, not NTAC.
NISAP.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's not. I wasn't. Okay.
Right.
I thought NTAC helped support it, but there was some website that went up that OJJDP supported, and I don't recall the name of it.
Well, they have their model programs guide, which has some information, and then Crime Solutions also looks at some screening and risk assessments. Not what you're thinking.
No, that's not what I'm thinking.
I think there's screening and risk assessment tools that are out there that exist that might be desirable. And once you look at them, you need to look at them with a very, very sharp eye to what the data is on the reliability and the validity of those instruments. And if a number is simply reported, that may not be so useful, which is why sometimes psychology can be very helpful in saying, yeah, that looks like it's a very reliable instrument, or that those numbers are not thrilling, or to offer some guidance on that.
I would just offer that what we generally suggest is we're constantly reviewing tools, and we're here to help support people to determine what's reliable and valid. One issue is that there's a lot of mental health screening tools that are reliable and valid. The question is, what works for you? So people ask, what's the best tool? And I'm going to say, well, where are you? What kind of staff do you have? What is it that you want to know? Because the best tool is dependent on who is putting it in place to some extent. So we answer those questions that people come to us and give us, and we help them work through what tool is probably best for them.
Okay, I have a couple of questions I want to make sure I'm able to ask
Okay.
here. One of these has come up more than once. What are the 2 states that have passed legislation protecting assessment information pre-adjudication?
Pennsylvania and Illinois.
Pennsylvania and
Connecticut.
Illinois.
And Connecticut has too?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. There are examples of the legislation is actually in our implementation guide that we showed you. There's a whole appendix that goes with it that gives you examples of that legislation so that you might model it in your state if you were interested.
And if people go to Models for
Connecticut,
Change, can they get the implementation guide at no charge?
Yes,
Okay.
as well as the appendix, which has that information in it.
Great.
Yes.
Regarding the bifurcation of the risk assessment and the needs assessment, would you or does research support the use of a needs assessment only on juveniles who score high on a risk assessment?
No. And this is a complicated question to answer. So if you're doing a comprehensive risk assessment, which already has dynamic risk factors in it, which is what I mean when I say needs, you don't need to screen. You can do that with everybody. There are tools like the YAZI, or the PACT, they're both variations of the same tool, which have a process. So you do a screen first, and then you use it to make a decision about whether you're going to move on to do the more comprehensive assessment. That's one package. That's one method of doing it. There's other tools that just move in right to the comprehensive assessment. You don't have to screen someone first to do the comprehensive assessment. That's not necessary. the type of tool you want to pick is going to be dependent, again, on your resources, the point at which you're putting it in place, whether you need a short tool or a long tool, and so on.
I'm afraid we're going to have to close this out. I want to thank both of our presenters for the wealth of information they've shared with us today. At this point, we fielded as many questions as we could squeeze in. We hope you've enjoyed participating in a live workshop presentation at the 20th National Symposium on Juvenile Services. We also want to thank OJJDP National Training and Technical Assistance Center and its staff for providing the platform and staff support that made this webinar possible. For those electronic participants, if you will stay on the line, we would love for you to complete an online evaluation at the end of the session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
And thank you for helping us get through our technical issues.
And thank you, Pam, for all the work you did.
Thank you.
No, it's